everyone, my name is Beth Mendenhall, and I am giving the closing arguments lecture, the Ocean edition, for the Turns Case lecture series. So, as I mentioned, my name is Beth. I debated in high school at Kansas High School Debate at St. Thomas Aquinas High School, and I won the state championship in policy and LD in 2006. And then in college, I debated at Kansas State, and in 2011 won the CEDA National Championship. Since then, I've been doing a little coaching and judging here and there. I work at the Gonzaga Institute in the summers and the Women's Debate Institute, of course. I'm on the board of directors for them. And I'm a little bit out of the game, but I'm also in a PhD program here at Johns Hopkins working on a dissertation about the interactions between science and technology and global environments like the ocean. So the ocean and ocean's governance is my first dissertation chapter that I'm currently working on, which I guess qualifies me as a topic expert, but it's hard for any PhD student who hasn't yet finished their dissertation to feel like they're an expert just yet. So before I get started, I want to put in a plug for the Women's Debate Institute. The application deadline is April 15th, so you got a couple weeks left. It's a tuition-free camp. We have travel support. It's about community building for women in debate. And our mission is to figure out why when you move from high school to college and from the novice to the elite levels, there are less and less women in debate. So if you're interested in the organization, please go to our website, womensdebateinstitute.org. Consider donating or consider applying if you're a self-identified woman in high school. It's a really great organization. Okay, so let's get started. I've got this PowerPoint that hopefully you can follow along with me. So the title is Closing Arguments, and when I think of this, it's not closing arguments in the sense of your 2AR arguments, but more like the close of the debate season, reflecting back on this ocean's resolution. Because I have to say, I was initially very excited about this resolution. I'm still very excited about it. It's important that we talk about the ocean, but I'm not super involved with high school debate, but I've been perusing the case list. I've talked to several of my friends who are coaches, and I was disappointed to hear that offshore continental shelf drilling is one of the most popular affirmatives, because I feel like there's so much more that we can be talking about with this oceans topic. And so when I put together this lecture, my thought process was, what did I want to see or expect to see from this topic that I feel like I haven't seen fully explored at high school debate tournaments. So starting with my preview slide, the lecture is sort of divided into 4 parts. At the beginning, I'm going to say some general things about the resolution and its interaction with the ocean and with the law of the sea regime. And then there are 3 parts where I'm going to talk about different ways to look at the ocean and the ways we can, as humans, interact with the ocean. So I'm going to think of the ocean as a cornucopia of resources, as flows between human communities, especially economic aspects of human interaction, and then seeing the ocean as an arena for interstate interaction. So moving to the next slide. I titled this Taking the Ocean Metaphor Case Seriously. So I really like this argument, and I'm referring here to the piece of Philip Steinberg evidence that suggests that considering the ocean as a metaphor, or considering the ocean from the perspective of cultural or social human phenomenon, misses the important material aspects of the ocean. And when Steinberg refers to the materiality of the ocean, he means a couple of things. He means the geophysical aspects of the ocean, so issues like acidification, phenomena like ocean circulation, but he also means the ecosphere aspect of the ocean, the food chains and the food networks, animal migration routes, all those aspects of the ocean that are more than just the way that humans perceive and interact with the ocean. I like this argument. I know that it's very popular, but I feel like it hasn't been taken seriously in the sense that I don't see its insights reflected in the AF case list. And I will say, Philip Steinberg is a scholar that I read for my dissertation. He also has a book, The Social Construction of the Ocean. It's a 2010 book, which suggests to me that Steinberg himself thinks that there are important ways in which the ocean is socially constructed that have to be considered. And that book in particular talks about the ocean as a network of capitalist flows as a result of transoceanic shipping. We'll talk about that later on, though. But I'll also say Steinberg has a WordPress website, and you can subscribe to it, so he'll send you an email every time he publishes something new on this topic. So perhaps a good idea. Another reason I'm disappointed that the oceans topic, I feel like, hasn't really taken the materiality of the ocean seriously is that the seabed is frankly the most boring part of the ocean. And I'll talk in a minute about topicality interpretations, but I was a little disappointed to see the focus on not just OCS drilling, but energy production, whether it's renewable or not, and mineral extraction. I feel like there's so much more we can be thinking about with regard to the ocean. So the next slide, this is a more accurate representation, I think, of how people have been viewing the ocean on this topic. The darker areas here represent the exclusive economic zone, which is that 200-mile out, where it's not sovereignty, but it's really like a strong version of jurisdiction, such that the outer continental shelf it's not exactly an EEZ claim, it's actually a separate extension from the EEZ claim, but basically if the United States can prove that its outer continental shelf up to 350 miles out is connected to the continental shelf of the terrestrial United States, the actual land parts, then we control those seabed resources. And I can understand why people have focused on the continental shelf because the legal claims are very clear, despite the fact that the United States hasn't ratified the law of the sea. We have declared those resources ours, and it is consistent with what the law of the sea would interpret as areas of United States ownership over the seabed and jurisdiction over the water column. A note on topicality. I wonder if Earth's oceans sanctions global deployments of ships or instrumentation or submarines in terms of the water column above the seabed. The way the resolution is worded, it suggests to me that it could still be topical to, for instance, explore a portion of the ocean that is beyond the EEZ, beyond the outer continental shelf, like the deep high seas in maybe the middle of the Pacific. So I don't think there's a topicality constraint to the portions of the ocean that have national ownership or national jurisdiction, such as the EEZ. So moving to the next slide, this is about the term development in the resolution. And I think that this is the most constraining portion of the resolution, or it has been empirically when I look at the case list, when I look at topicality arguments. And, you know, like I said, I haven't judged a lot of debates on this topic, so I'm coming to development from an academic perspective, I guess, as opposed to from the perspective of someone who's been in a bunch of these topicality debates. But when I think about development, it implies that there is a progression towards something. You know, the other side of development is de-development, which suggests moving forward and moving back. And so there has to be some standard by which we measure what is a movement forward and what is a movement back. And I think that in the most general sense, development implies a movement from chaos to order, from lack of management to management. I think this is reflected in the dictionary definitions of development, and I worry that reliance on these legal definitions of development is always going to be overly constraining because they're written often in a legal context applying to a specific type of development. And it might be more appropriate because the ocean is such a large portion of the planet, because humans use it in multiple ways, because it has a really important effect on human society, to think of it not in a narrow legal context, but in terms of our large-scale interactions with the ocean. I'll also say that the Law of the Sea Treaty does use the term development in the context of resources. But as you know, the Law of the Sea Treaty is supposed to deal with the multiple uses of the ocean. So by resources, it means a lot more than, you know, the fish that you can catch in your net or the deep seabed minerals that you can collect through the International Seabed Treaty. It means the resources in a more holistic sense. So for example, to develop a fishery means much more than to extract a lot of fish. It also means to regulate and manage the fishery based on information about the fish population. So fishery can, as a term, refer to where the fish live, but more specifically in the context of the Law of the Sea Treaty, where the fish are fished where they live. And so developing a fishery can mean developing this area of the ocean that includes valuable resource populations, like tuna, for instance, to develop that into a fishery in terms of how many boats are allowed, what kind of catch equipment are they allowed to use, where are they allowed to sell the fish, how do they have to verify that they're fishing in a regulated and legal way. I also think that in a more general definition, this might be a little bit harder to defend, but you can think about developing the ocean regime, moving from unmanaged to managed. So if your AF has an effect on the precedents or practices or legal standards surrounding ocean uses, I think that arguably that can be a form of development because you're moving from chaos to order, you're moving from unmanaged to managed. And so I think that another thing about the development definition is every definition of development includes within it a metaphysics, a suggestion about what the ocean is, and also a value system, a suggestion about what the ocean is for. And so these definitions of development that are just about resource extraction definitely view the ocean in a particular way, as sort of like a cornucopia from which we can just pick and choose what we want. Basically, they view the ocean as a resource. And if you consider the ocean as more than just a resource, but as a complex geophysical whole that includes an ecosphere of multiple overlapping ecosystems, then development can mean much more in terms of human interactions than just taking what we want from the ocean. So I would really consider you all to, encourage you all to consider more expansive definitions of development. All right, moving to the next slide. So I included just some arguments that I want to make into this PowerPoint. So just sort of think of these as food for thought, I guess, or priming your topicality blocks. I don't think the seabed is the ocean. I think that Earth's oceans means the water column. It doesn't mean the topography of the sea floor. I think that this is a more intuitive definition because frequently in the literature, and in the literature I'm referring to the academic literature, there is a lot of overlap with debate literature, but often the places where you find the best debate cards are more rhetorically powerful, less qualified. So I'm not referring to blogs here. I'm referring to peer-reviewed, published academic publications. So intuitively, ocean is contrasted with ocean basins. Often when we refer to an ocean basin, we're trying to use a geophysical indicator to explain why it makes sense to say this is the Atlantic basin, this is the Pacific basin. But Earth's oceans, going back to that first slide, there's an essential unity to Earth's oceans that is not implied by the term oceanic basins, which could have been something that the writers of the resolution chose instead. I also think that the distinction between the seabed, the ocean basin, and the ocean itself is reflected in the international regimes that manage the ocean. So for example, there's a separate arms control treaty for weapons on the seabed, and there is no arms control treaty with the exception of some effects on delivery vehicles like ICBMs and stuff. There's no equivalent arms control treaty for weapons in the water column, like submarine launched ballistic missiles. So there's a legal distinction there. Also, there is the International Seabed Authority, which is the part of the ISA, the part of UNCLOS. It's the reason why the United States hasn't ratified the Law of the Sea, which is a whole separate question. But that just deals with the resources of the seabed, and we use this A, B, and J, that's areas beyond national jurisdiction, to refer to the water column above the seabed that is not managed by the ISA, is not managed by national governments via the EEZ or the continental shelf concept. A, B, and J is a separate concept, a separate area that just thinking about the seabed doesn't capture. There's a distinction there conceptually. Also, so hydrosphere refers to the ocean environment, I guess. It should be enough. There's so much going on in the ocean in the water column that to focus on the seabed, it loses a lot of the value of the ocean's topic, I think. And then just in terms of the topic education, I think that focusing on the seabed, and an example is the outer continental shelf drilling affirmative, or any affirmative that takes resources from the Earth's crust that is below the water column of the ocean, is the inherent barrier to that, the reason why the status quo isn't pursuing those options, is extremely political, which means that a seabed dominant interpretation is going to trigger generic politics DAs much more than a water column affirmative would. Because, for instance, you can easily reverse the moratorium. It would be President Obama reversing the moratorium on drilling in certain areas of the continental shelf. There are also a lot of entrenched interests around continental shelf drilling and mining because those lobbies are so big and powerful. So there will be a very political reaction to any of those asks. The other thing is, the resources we can get from the seabed, we can also get from land, which means that if you get, like a natural gas prices DA or an oil prices DA, you can have that on any topic that allows you to extract resources from land areas. And so I think that focusing on the seabed tends to negate the value of an ocean's topic. So that's just my piece. Okay. So the next slide here is just a representation of the ocean as the water column as opposed to the seabed. And the reason I included this is just one way that you can divide the ocean into layers. The ocean it's not uniform despite the fact that there is an essential unity to the ocean. So if you think about whale migrations, for instance, they don't care about the difference between the Pacific and the Indian and the Atlantic Ocean. They go where the food is, where their reproduction zones are, etc. So there's an essential unity in that sense. But whales, for instance, sperm whales, for instance, the depth that they dive to capture their prey has a lot to do with the quality of the water at certain depths. So you get variations in temperature and density and also pressure, obviously a lot more pressure as you go down. And so the layers of the ocean represent different environments for different types of species that interact based on that layering. So you may have encountered this reality about the ocean in terms of an OTEC affirmative, which uses the difference in temperature between these layers to generate energy. And so my only point here is that the hydrosphere, the Earth's oceans, the water column, as opposed to the basin or the seabed, is very complex and detailed in a way that conditions our interactions with the ocean, whether it's development or exploration. And this is the reason why the ocean circulates in various ways too. So, for instance, if you have freshwater runoff from the mouth of a river, that's going to change the temperature of the water at the surface, but also its salinity and therefore its density, and it causes oceanic mixing in particular ways. That's just one example of how mixing is triggered. But my point is that oceanography has only in the last few decades really started to observe and measure and understand oceanic layering and the resulting oceanic mixing. More information about that, more exploration of the water column is going to make us much more able to understand things like animal migrations or pollution pathways or opportunities for offshore energy, renewable-based, ocean circulation-based energy. So we don't need the seabed. The hydrosphere should be enough, is my final point here. Okay, so I mentioned the areas beyond national jurisdiction, and this slide is sort of a news flash. Newsflash, the United Nations committee that deals with these issues is trying to start negotiations for a new treaty to extend the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to the area beyond national jurisdiction. So basically what happened was we didn't have any ability to manage the animal populations that were outside the EEZ. There was no legal authority to do so. And after a while, we started to realize that's a terrible idea because trawling has gotten deeper and deeper and further out, and we've discovered new animal resource populations at the bottom of the deep sea. It wasn't until like the 1960s that we were sure that there was even life in the deep ocean, and now every time we go, we find new species. There's also the discovery of seamounts, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But my point is, since the United Nations Third Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is how we got the UNCLOS treaty that we ended up with, we have come to the realization that those resources need legal management. There needs to be oversight, or else we're going to rapidly deplete them. So, lucky timing for us, this committee, the open-ended informal consultative process on oceans and the law of the sea, whatever committee of the UN runs that, has a deadline of September to generate a proposal. I believe it's going to the UN General Assembly about negotiating this new treaty. They're having an informal consultative meeting next month, which your AF could easily communicate with or have something to say to or have an interaction with in some way or another. And so I think that there are actions that the United States could take, in addition to your AF taking an action, in a less role-playing sense of solvency. But if you do want to role-play your solvency, the United States made a unilateral declaration in 1945 that triggered the Law of the Sea Treaty and resulted in the EEZ concept in the first place. So there's a huge historical precedent for United States unilateral actions to generate international law of the sea. So in 1945, it was the Truman Proclamations. There were two, one related to fishery resources, one related to the continental shelf. They triggered a wave of new unilateral declarations by the Latin American countries and by the African countries, and that forced the negotiation of a law of the sea treaty, and it had the EEZ concept in its fledgling form already out there. So the United States could explore to discover more information about the biological resources that need to be protected. There could be more scientific evidence that we need an A, B, and J treaty. If you consider development in an ecological sense, developing an ecosystem, whether it's for resource purposes or not, then that could also generate new useful information for supporting various positions on an A, B, and J treaty. I meant to mention this on the development slide. So this is kind of it's a little further out interpretation of development. But if you think about development as movement from simplicity to complexity, so developing and recognizing that complexity and diversity is more healthy for an ecosystem in terms of stability, in terms of animals are adapted to living in a certain level of complexity or diversity in terms of an ecosystem environment. So if you think of development in an ecological sense, then actually restraining activities in the ocean could be a development of the ocean if you think of the ecosphere of the ocean, if you think of ecosystems and their qualities. So another interpretation of development to consider. All right, moving to the next slide. This is just a brainstorm list of problems that the ocean is facing. I started here with my dissertation actually because these are challenges for ocean governance. And you notice that a lot of them are environmental. And this is one reason why I really want to emphasize the non-seabed aspects of the ocean, because that's where all this stuff is happening. So there's a lot of pollution. So examples of shore-based pollution would include dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico as a result of agricultural fertilizer runoff that goes to the Mississippi River Basin. Another example, is the big floating plastic gyre in the Pacific. All that plastic comes from the shore. Ship-based pollution. I cannot believe that cruise ships are still so popular. Marine natural resources was actually my very first debate topic when I was a novice in, 2003, I think. And RF was about cruise ships and how wasteful they are and how they, there are lots of emissions. There's like gray water. Basically, they just dump all their waste into the ocean as they go around. And they also use ballast water. As people get on and off the ship, they have to fill up the ballast with water to keep the buoyancy at the correct level. What about an AF that develops ecotourism, which would trade off with the cruise ship industry? I'm guessing the cruise ship industry is maybe on the brink. I mean, they seem to be, I don't know, I see ads for a lot of specials for cruise ships, and there's so much knowledge out there about how cruise ships are bad for the environment. But that is something that an AF could deal with by changing the industry, by encouraging an ecotourism-based industry as opposed to the cruise ship industry that we have now. So these other, you can look at this list yourself. You're probably familiar with a bunch of these things, but these are problems that the AF can target in various ways by developing alternatives, by exploring enough to discover more about the problem. I think that there are not enough environment AFs given the degree of environmental issues or the number of environmental issues in the ocean. All right, next slide. What is happening in the ocean in terms of ecosystems is a radical simplification of ecosystems. So this is a photo of a jellyfish bloom. If there's one species that's benefiting from global warming, it's the jellyfish, because a more acidic ocean kills off jellyfish predators, opens up more habitat space for jellyfish, and they can survive. This is also referred to as the rise of slime or evolution in reverse. It's a simplification of ecosystems that is happening now and could arguably be de-development of the ocean as ecosphere. One problem with jellyfish blooms in general, well, two problems. Number one, they get in the way of human use activities. A bunch of jellyfish clogged the intake of cooling water in Sweden at a nuclear reactor, and they had to like get all the jellyfish out. It's kind of gross. But another thing in terms of the ecosystem is jellyfish blooms transfer energy from the food that they eat away from fish and to bacteria. So their general ecosystem effect is to radically simplify further by replacing fish populations with bacterial populations, basically. So that's a general problem. Oh, I said I would talk about seamounts. I'm on the next slide now. Hopefully you know what a seamount is. And it is a way, I think, to strengthen your biodiversity advantage. So given that there's a radical simplification of ocean ecology, a biodiversity advantage is important but difficult to win because there are so many alternative causes. But a seamount is a special instance of biodiversity in that arguably, not all ecosystems are created equal in terms of valuable genetic resources, in terms of uniqueness, diversity, isolation, or integration with other ecosystems. Arguably, seamounts are biodiversity hotspots insofar as they are populated by extremophiles of various types. So these are organisms that live in very extreme conditions, like for instance, the extreme pressure of the deep sea, the lack of sunlight, the extreme heat that is coming out of these ocean thermal vents. They basically spew out really chemically rich, really hot water. Okay, so these are genetic resources that we have not had access to prior. You know, the genetic resources are important for medicine. They're important for like GMO foods, for getting new ideas and new gene strains there. They're important for sciences of evolutionary biology. We need to know about these seamounts. But the thing is, moving to the next slide, trawlers take them down left and right. So trawling, as I said, is getting deeper and deeper. And there are types of trawling, benthic trawling it's called, that basically drag the nets along the seafloor. So the top left corner of this slide is a satellite image of ocean trawling basically kicking up these plumes of seafloor, basically sediment. They run into a seamount, totally destroy that ecological community. It might take hundreds of, maybe thousands of years to rebuild that community because they're so isolated from one another. What else was I going to say about trawling? Oh yeah, we used to think that trawling was good for the seabed because it would stir up nutrients. And we thought that relatively recently, which just goes to show that there is a real dearth of scientific information about the impacts of trawling on the deep seabed and especially on seamounts. That's something that we need to explore further. All right, next slide. This is another one of my arguments. Resolved, we should securitize the environment. So, it's funny, I'm sitting in this office that I share with my advisor, Dan Dudney, and I think it was 1990, he was a former debater. In fact, he keeps his pens in a speaker award from the Wake Forest debate tournament from 1971. He was the second speaker. But anyway, in 1990, he wrote this article, Why We Should Not Securitize the Environment, and he wrote it like a debate. Well, he calls it a brief, but a front line, basically. So he's like, here are the 4 arguments why we shouldn't securitize the environment, and here are my preemptive answers to what, the other side is going to say. This is the one point that he and I really disagree on. And I think that securitizing the environment actually makes a lot of sense in the context of this resolution, because you have to do non-military exploration and development. Oceanography has been dominated, controlled, its directions have been given to it by the military for a really long time, since World War II. And so to describe the environment as a security threat, the way we refer to Iran and ISIS as security threats, for instance, could encourage a shift of resources from military uses to non-military uses. And the reason why I think it's important is the problem with the environment, especially with the ocean environment, is much, much worse than it seems. And that's especially because we have a privileged perspective in the United States. I'm floored by how many people eat fish given what we know about overfishing, and we'll get to that in a couple of slides. But you've probably heard about the Gaia interpretation of the Earth. So Gaia started as an Earth system science concept in the 1970s to explain the degree of integration and the level of interaction between ecosystems on planet Earth. But then it got all these mystical, sort of religious connotations. But the basic gist of the Gaia hypothesis is that life has created the conditions for its own survival. So the point is that ecosystem communities have large-scale effects on their geophysical environment that makes that environment hospitable to them. So basically there's a mutually beneficial relationship between ecosystems and the domains in which they live, like the ocean. So, a great example of this is just plankton blooms every year. The bloom of marine micro-autotrophs, so basically tiny, tiny little plants, they generate something like a third of the Earth's oxygen, which is the reason why we can survive in the first place. That's just one example of life making the Earth hospitable for other life. However, recently, 2009 is this book. I think the book, maybe it was an article. This is the Medea hypothesis. So Medea, like Gaia, is another mythical Earth mother. But Medea, which represents the human population, I think she's a sorceress that cut off her own head or something. The point is that life is self-undermining, that the human population is destroying the conditions for its own survival because of this radical oversimplification of ocean ecology. I really believe that's what's happening. I think that we are very ignorant about the impact we're having on the ocean. We lack baseline data. That's the data that you get about the population before it was exploited, so you can tell how exploited or how simplified or how collapsed that ecosystem is. We don't have that data. We do not have a grasp on how intense the problem is, but my hypothesis is that it's extremely intense, which is the reason why we need to securitize the environment, because it could co-opt or redirect some of the most massive, most well-supported state resources. Why not take money and resources and time and energy from the Department of Defense and push it towards exploration and development of the ocean? I think that there's a lot of dual-use capacity and dual-use technology that's currently being dominated by the military that could be dominated by non-military oceanographic endeavors. So for instance, a lot of the weapons technology we've developed, like undersea armed drones potentially, I'm sure DARPA is working on that now, or they will soon. Those can be used for surveillance purposes. Even aerial drones can be used for surveillance purposes in the ocean. It would also potentially empower new lobbies. Why not bring Greenpeace to the bargaining table instead of Northrop Grumman or Boeing or the other major defense contractors? The impact is totally non-unique. Security ideologies are already ruining the environment. So this Hamblin book that I cited here, it's called Arming Mother Nature. It's all about the recent decades, the history of the military using the environment to create weapons. And so using security ideology when talking about the environment can be framed as a way to shift resources to non-military means of interacting with and coming to know the ocean, which I think is a good idea. All right, next slide. So this is, gosh, I've taken a really long time on the intro. This is the first section, seeing the ocean as a resource as fisheries. So I've already talked a little bit about why I think the ecosphere is the most important part of the ocean. Ecosystem services, that's part of the Gaia hypothesis, the fact that these ecosystems create benefits for us, like for instance absorbing our pollution, providing us with oxygen. Global primary productivity represents, and we can see this from satellite maps, it's really amazing actually, the energy blooms in the ocean that start at the bottom level of the food chain with giant plankton blooms, move up the food chain, and then eventually get on your dinner plate in the form of whatever fish you happen to be eating today. And so I think that the human population is extremely reliant on the ocean for both ecosystem services and for food in a way that this topic is not fully accounting for, I guess. So fisheries are important because they, remember, fishery is the location of a fish population that is exploited by fishing boats. They deal with every layer of the food chain. So these are some specialized words that I would hope that you would know from this topic. Benthic means bottom, seafloor. Anadromous means fish that go back and forth between rivers. So salmon's a good example. They spawn in rivers and then they're ocean fish. Coastal fisheries, haddock, cod, halibut, a lot of the fish that you see on your plate. And then pelagic fisheries, those are the ones that are in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So tuna, swordfish, your big charismatic megafauna fish. You could have an app that could interact with any of these kinds of fisheries, and all of them are important for the rest of the food chain. All right, now I got some imagery slides. Basically, the next 5 slides or so are to impress upon you how much of a problem we're in, how much of a problem we have with fisheries. So one thing we've been doing is called fishing down the food chain. Basically, we fish all the old, slow, big, meaty fish until they're gone. And then in those populations, we fish the younger versions of those fish until they're gone. And then we fish the fish that those fish ate until they're gone, and we move down the food chain. So the price of tuna goes up, and sardines become more available. That characterizes, in a specific anecdotal instance, what's been happening with global fisheries over the last several decades. There are less fish at the top, so we have to fish the tiny young fish at the bottom, which is a problem for simplifying ecosystems. And it's a reason why the entire endeavor of global fishing is unsustainable, because it's not obvious, because we still have very large catches, but we need to focus on the fish that we are able to catch, and the fish that it is cheap to catch, and the fish that there is a market for. And that, in general terms, has been characterized by fishing down the food chain. All right, next slide. Bycatch. You've probably heard of it. If you haven't, oh my gosh, please learn about it. It's basically, you're trying to catch the shrimp, and you catch all these other animals instead, and they die, but you're not going to sell them, so you just dump them overboard. It's terrible because it's a destruction of ocean ecosystems that is unrelated to producing resources. Unrelated in the sense that these animals aren't caught to be sold and eaten. They aren't benefiting anyone with their protein. It just so happens that there's no economic incentive to reduce the bycatch rate. I use this slide because shrimp fisheries are supposed to be some of the worst in terms of bycatch, and in fact, some studies have suggested that any any shrimp you eat from the Gulf of Mexico is likely to have a 90% bycatch rate. So here's my plug: stop eating shrimp. I'm a vegetarian, so it's really hard for me to separate my ideology about animals in the ocean from this particular lecture, so apologies if I'm being obnoxious. All right, next slide. Invasive species. This is a lionfish. It's in the Caribbean. It has no predators. Not really great for ecosystems. Invasive species have a lot to do with ballast water taken in by cruise ships and other kinds of ships. Ballast water regulations could help develop those ecosystems in terms of complexity. Just a thought. All right, state of the global fisheries. This is the next slide. I'm not going to harp on this too much. Please read the facts. But one of the biggest problems with global fisheries is lack of scientific data for baselines, which you can develop through exploration of the ocean. Another problem is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So even when the regulations exist, they're not being followed. Surveillance drones could help with that. Anything that can make more visible to us who is fishing what where, which can be done through science and technology, can be done through exploration and development, would be extremely helpful in terms of managing global fisheries stock. Government subsidies definitely characterize the United States fishing industry. They've changed over time. There's a lot of old college evidence from that topic a few years ago. Those subsidies are for development of fisheries. Tweak those subsidies a little bit. It's still development, but it's development of a different kind of better regulated fishery. So there's a mechanism for you. All right, next slide. So I developed this from a lecture that I gave for a water politics class earlier, and some of these slides I just kept because I thought they could provide interesting AF ideas. So this one is just a representation of aquaculture production in terms, this is represents millions of tons, and it's reported by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And the reason I kept this slide in, I mean, I know there are aquaculture AFs, but growing aquatic plants, you see here that they've expanded too, might be a pretty cool way to develop the ocean. It's development in the sense of turning a meadow into a crop field is development. So you're organizing it for the purposes of production. Seaweed, we should probably eat more seaweed. It's also an important product, so I'd be interested to see how many of the aquatic, or how much of the aquatic plant aquaculture comes from the United States, because that could be a cool new market for the future, especially as we run out of fish. All right, next slide. Ooh, I have to try really hard not to spend a lot of time on this slide. So, I just read this book by Finley in 2011 called All the Fish in the Sea, which is makes a general argument about the basis of all global fisheries management. So basically, after World War II, the United States wanted to have its fish and eat them too, in the sense that we wanted to be able to take fish from other people's coastlines, specifically bait fish, so we could go catch tuna in the deep sea, bait fish from Latin America, the little guys they put on the end of the hook. But we wanted to protect our own coastal fisheries, like the salmon population in Alaska. So U.S. fisheries scientists, and more specifically State Department bureaucrats, came up with this concept of maximum sustainable yield. And it sounds really good, right? It sounds like sustainable development. Only take as much fish as you can without collapsing the fishery. But it's a much more ideological or political concept than it is a scientific concept. It has these several assumptions, many of which can be criticized as using a form of scientism to make capitalism seem sustainable when it's not actually, because maximum sustainable yield encourages fishing up to the maximum because it sees any fish that could be taken but was not as waste. The problem is, we don't have the scientific data to tell us in a given fish population how much is the maximum that is sustainable, because it depends on a lot of stuff that we don't know about fisheries. Sampling fisheries is very, very difficult. It's very undeveloped or underdeveloped science. But the other thing is ecosystem interactions are very important determinants of fish reproduction and growth. And so even if we know a lot about salmon, for instance, if we don't know a lot about their predators and prey, then we really don't know all that much about salmon. And so maximum sustainable yield was used to say, our salmon, they're sustained to they're fish to the maximum now, but your bait fish, they're not, because you don't have the scientific evidence. So basically, maximum sustainable yield shifts the burden of proof to those who want to say that the stock is depleted, and those who want to say that the stock is not depleted and they want to fish more, they don't have any burden of scientific evidence. And so maximum sustainable yield is used to sanction overfishing. There are several ways that you could affect maximum sustainable yield, which would have reverberations for global fisheries. Before I move on to that, I'll just note here that it has extremely important relationship with the system of global capitalism. And it's very related to scientific data deficiency. So moving on to the next slide, ways you could solve it. You could get rid of it. I mean, it was originally a United States concept. The United States, starting with the 1955 Rome Conference that talked about fisheries management, basically exported this concept to the rest of the world. We forced Japanese fisheries to adopt it after World War II. There probably aren't a lot of solvency advocates for this because I think there's a lot of criticism of maximal sustainable yield. And Finley, that book I referred to, does suggest on the very last page of the book an alternative scientific concept. So I'm not sure if solvency evidence exists about exporting a new concept, but you could easily have the parts of the USFG that deal with fisheries management adopt a new scientific concept and provide resources to pursue that scientific concept. Or you could just, have a solvency mechanism that's like, we should imagine a different, better world. I know that evidence exists. The other thing you could do is, like I said, the burden of proof shifts to proving that the fish are scarce as opposed to proving that they're abundant. It's an artificially high standard of proof, but you could just meet that standard and count the fish, transfer the technology for measuring fisheries and observing fish populations to prove that the maximum sustainable yield has been exceeded and lots of global fisheries. And so therefore you can take advantage of existing fisheries management organizations. Like for instance, I think there are 19 that deal with tuna. Yeah, I think there's 19. Anyway, look that up. But if you can prove that those tuna populations that they are managing have been fished beyond the maximum, then that would force them to react and regulate the fishery in a stricter way. The other thing you can do is just criticize the concept as being an example of scientism, as being an example of economic imperialism, because it allows long-distance fisheries like the United States, Japan, Russia to say, hey, African coastal states, you don't have any science to say your fish are scarce, so we're just going to take a bunch of them, but stay out of our salmon fishery because it's reached the maximum already. It's a way to result in inequality of access and inequality of resource exploitation that is really honestly imperialist. So, maximum sustainable yield is a bad concept. You should fix it. All right, moving on. Oh, topicality. Okay, so I've mentioned a lot. I think more scientific data is exploration. I think your definition should easily back that. I've talked about different concepts of development. If you can get a concept that's about developing the resources as a whole, sort of like the economy of this resource, then I think you can easily deal with fisheries. So I already talked about this in a previous slide, so let's move on. This is a cuttlefish. It's just a transition slide. It's an awesome ocean creature, and I don't know, it's really pretty. So moving to oceans as flows, telecommunications. So this picture on the right here is a submarine telecommunications cable. These cables, they're the backbone of the international economy. They're where the internet lives. They're where the financial aspects of the economy live. They're where bank transactions happen. They're on the sea floor, so not under the seabed. They're technically in the water column. And they're the foundation of the global economy. So if you think the global economy is set up in a bad way, then submarine cables are a topical inroad for you to do things like criticize neoliberalism or capitalism. The other thing is underwater submarine telecommunications cables are the result of this technological race that's been occurring since around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century between wireless communication technology and wired technology. I think the book I'm referring to is called Under the Sea. I didn't cite it here because it is much more historical. It wouldn't generate any solvency evidence for you. But basically there's been this competition like this. There's been 3 bouts of it. And the last competition between wireless and wired technology occurred between satellite communications and fiber optic submarine cables. Initially, like probably early 90s, maybe late 80s, everyone was like, satellites are the future of communication. You know, that's where I'm going to get my TV, that's how my phone calls are going to work, that's how the internet's going to work. You know, that was the future of communication. But then there were all these advances in fiber optic cables, so now more of those communications exist in a wired format than a wireless format. The reason I bring this up is um, changing the technology by making it less vulnerable. For instance, submarine cables less vulnerable. They're very vulnerable to disruption by earthquakes, by tsunamis, by terrorist attacks. In a great power war, they might become involved. Whether if reinforcing or pointing out the vulnerabilities of submarine telecommunications cables could have ramifications for the alternate model of information exchange represented by satellites. They might be more or less surveillable or controllable by governments. You know, you could make like a radical economic libertarianism argument about where the internet should live. Should it live in satellites or should it live in submarine telecommunications cables? And so the reason I bring up the wireless wired technology race is that you could potentially affect that by affecting the viability of submarine cable-based telecommunications. So you could make a larger statement about how communication, and especially information and big data, should flow between human populations by having an app that interacts with submarine cables. So here's a picture of the major, I guess, bundles of submarine telecommunications cables. And as you can see, a lot of them go in and out of U.S. coastlines. Again, I think global deployments can apply outside the EEZ, but you don't have to leave the EEZ or even the sea floor to have this kind of app. All right, the next slide with the big red lines and the blue ocean background, this represents shipping routes. So this is another form of oceanic communication, but it's transporting goods and services as opposed to transporting information. So moving to the next slide, SLOCs is a good term to know, sea lines of communication. This little graphic with the pigeons already existed on the internet. I didn't even have to create it. These are the paradigm activity in a globalized world. Transoceanic shipping and navigation is how globalization started in the first place, ships going from continent to continent. And the vast majority of global trade is still exchanged via ships. So if you affect the shipping industry, that has implications for the global capitalist industrial system characterized by extreme trade interdependence, for instance. This is a point of vulnerability of these systems. The transoceanic shipping system interacts in significant ways with the ocean ecosphere. So you've probably heard in the context of whales and other marine mammals about the problems associated with noise or with ship strikes. The Marine Mammal Protection Act is a really important piece of domestic legislation that I guess creates tension with the imperatives of global shipping relative to the requirements of the ecosphere. So what else do I have here? Yeah, they also cause a lot of problems in the ocean in terms of ballast water, in terms of chemical discharge. So if there is a way that you can develop the ocean in terms of the ocean being a smooth surface for global shipping, which is as represented by that Steinberg 2010 book, The Social Construction of the Ocean. He describes the ocean in this way. Then I don't know, you could have an argument about capitalism. These could be infrastructure development type topicality arguments. I also want to mention that the global shipping flows present lots of different choke points. So choke point is a point of vulnerability where very important flows flow through a very vulnerable space. So if you don't know where these three places I've listed here are, go ahead and look those up on Google Maps. Those are important places to know just for like being a human citizen. I only want to talk about one of them, which is the Malacca Strait. A very large portion of global shipping, I think it's maybe like a third of all global shipping of goods, goes through the Malacca Strait. It's very, very narrow. It used to be, up until about 2004, 2005, the epicenter of global piracy, which has since shifted to the Gulf of Aden, which is another one of those choke points I mentioned that's off the coast of Somalia and Ethiopia. But the Straits of Malacca are important because of the way they interact with U.S.-Chinese relations. The United States has a lot of allies in the region. We have a good relationship with Indonesia, with the Philippines. I think we have a security treaty with both the Philippines and Vietnam. This is very near the South China Sea, where China is making a lot of disputed territorial claims. China's Malacca dilemma is the fact that it imports, and Japan especially imports also, a ton of oil from the Middle East, and it all goes through this little choke point. And so the dilemma is the choke point is outside of Chinese EEZ territory, but it's extremely important to China's economy and especially economic security. The other thing is security in the Malacca Strait, whether you're trying to secure global shipping from piracy or from potentially, a great power shutting down the Malacca Strait. Iran occasionally threatens to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is another global choke point. Any great power, India and China, for instance, or even Indonesia, if it felt like messing things up, could shut down the Malacca Strait for a while. Those kinds of security concerns are extremely related to intelligence. So one of the reasons why global piracy in the Malacca Strait decreased a lot after 2005 was, for the first time, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia started sharing surveillance information. You get some aerial drones over that strait, you're going to know when piracy happens or when a naval power is threatening to shut down the Malacca Strait. The other thing is, submarine detection capabilities are really challenged by a strait environment, which is very, very noisy and relatively shallow. And so if you can develop undersea detection technology, that could also improve the security of this area of the world. Now, as I mentioned, Earth Oceans probably sanctions global deployments in terms of a topical affirmative. However, you don't necessarily have to do or send anything to the Malacca Strait in order to increase China's anxiety about your AF activities. So here I'm thinking about generating negative DA links. If you have an AF or a counterplan or whatever that does deep sea exploration, you're going to be getting very near the South China Sea region because the Marianas Trench, the deepest point in the ocean, is relatively near the Malacca Strait. You don't really have to be in it because China is considering this its sphere of influence. The other thing is a deep sea mining AF, some of the most productive, near-term feasible deep seabed mining locations are around, I think it's around Brunei, which shares the island of Borneo with Indonesia. Anyway, it's in this area. So any AF that deals with deep sea exploration or deep sea mineral extraction is probably going to be in this area. All right. And so China will get upset. That'll hurt tensions. I don't know. Might cause reactive mobilizations. I don't know. That's for you to decide. Or to discover in the literature, I guess. All right, the next slide is another transition slide. This is a basking shark. It's an awesome shark. Second biggest shark in the world. It's a global cosmopolitan migratory species in the sense that it goes all over the place. It's a filter feeder, so it's not coming after you, but it's got a big mouth, so it's scary. You could get sucked up into there maybe. Anyway, super cool shark. Second biggest shark in the world. Yeah, that's a transition. All right, the next slide. Seeing the ocean is an arena. The ocean is a place for states to interact. So if you're really interested in international relations, go to graduate school. It's super fun. But also, why don't we have more AFs that talk about interactions between states in a non-military, or because of dual-use technology or dual-use deployments, in a non-military that has military implications type of way. So I'm harping a lot on this dual-use internal link into affecting military or strategic relations because new practices, new activities in the ocean set legal precedents. So an important one is the concept of innocent passage, which is enshrined in the Law of the Sea Treaty. China says innocent passage excludes military ships. The United States says, no, it includes military ships. Is the Coast Guard military or not? I'm not sure. Anyway, that's an example of, I know it's untopical, but if you deployed something that was perceived as military by China, that could create a new precedent, a practice-based precedent that has implications or ramifications for military deployments. But the better dual-use internal link, I think, is technology. So a lot of technologies, and I'll talk about that in the next few slides, that are used for non-military, especially commercial purposes or research purposes, also have military implications. So the next slides are going to talk about two key examples of a place where a topical affirmative could have implications for strategic, military, and political interactions between states, especially between great powers like the United States, China, India, oh my God, I just said the Soviet Union, Russia. These are all already naval powers or becoming naval powers. Okay, so the first is territorial disputes. You probably heard about these in the Arctic, in the South China Sea. We got a couple of territorial disputes. We got one with China. The one in the Bering Sea with Russia isn't resolved. There's some big ticket territorial disputes, but there are something like 400 overall maritime boundaries in the world that have not been totally delimited. So it's a larger problem of ocean territorial disputes. The reason I bring this up in the context of dual use is these territorial disputes are frequently affected by material research and development in the ocean. So, for example, if you can prove that the United States or whoever, Britain, when they were in control of the United States, traversed the Northwest Passage before the explorers on behalf of Canada traversed the Northwest Passage, then that has implications for whether or not it's an international or an internal strait. Geological features are very important, so continental shelf claims, especially the dispute in the Arctic, is about whose continental shelf connects to the Lomonosov Ridge across the middle of the Arctic Ocean. That's something that you can easily bolster with more scientific information. And then also, there are a lot of articles lately about fisheries as a form of power projection. So if you develop a fishery by subsidizing a new set of boats to go to a new place, that's an example of extending your economic influence as a country, which is what China is doing in the South China Sea. They're continuously violating fisheries regulations because they need to establish a large presence in a particular area. So all of these commercial or political uses of the ocean have implications for territorial disputes. The second thing, I'll talk more when I get to the slide, but about submarine strategy. It's very technology based. It has a lot of implications for nuclear politics, and it's on the horizon of technological change. So let's go to the first slide about the continental shelf. So this just sort of summarizes the deal with making a continental shelf claim. The United States hasn't ratified the Law of the Sea, so arguably we could not submit a continental shelf claim to the Committee on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. It's the UNCLCS. However, we need to make an Arctic continental shelf claim. Getting more scientific data about the continental shelves in the Arctic and the Lomonosov Ridge in particular could have implications for how those territorial disputes are resolved. Or doing that kind of research in the Arctic could spark more Russian mobilization to deploy ships, whether they're military or not, in the Arctic, which could arguably increase the risk of conflict. Although I'm very optimistic that Arctic conflict will not occur, and so are most scholars of Arctic governance. They think it's mostly exaggeration and just like saber rattling. But anyway, so more scientific data about the continental shelf could affect territorial claims. All right, the next slide. Oh, this is the ridge in the middle of the Arctic that everyone's trying to claim, the Lomonosov Ridge. So you can see here, this image of the seafloor in the Arctic, it's a composite image. It could probably have much better detail. We don't have any baselines in the Arctic. We don't know that much about the geology of the Arctic seafloor. We need more scientific data, which could... Oh, the other thing is the United States is the upcoming... So there's a rotating chair of the Arctic Council. The United States is the next chair. So whatever the United States does in the Arctic in the next year sets a precedent for what the Arctic Council will do in the coming years, for what Arctic Council cooperation means. The Arctic Council has declared that the Law of the Sea Treaty will manage Arctic relations and Arctic cooperation. So having the United States be the chair is really interesting because the United States hasn't ratified the Law of the Sea. So really any new scientific activity we do in the Arctic, because the status of the territorial claims is important right now. Everyone's submitted their claim except for the United States now. And also because the U.S. is the chair, could have a lot of impacts on Arctic politics. Just a thought. All right, the next slide, you've probably seen this. This is the South China Sea territorial dispute. I don't want to talk in detail about it. It's hard to affect the territorial dispute and still be topical because it's a lot about military deployments. It's a lot about our allies. So arguably you could do something that is under an alliance relationship between Vietnam and the Philippines, maybe like joint exploration or joint development. But it might be kind of hard-pressed to be topical there. The reason I bring it up, though, going to the next slide, is the hide-and-seek race of submarines. So this is something my advisor and I are currently writing a paper on, and it's a hot topic right now because, like I talked about the technological race between wired and wireless, there's also been, throughout the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period, a race between the technology that finds submarines and the technology that hides submarines. A true hide-and-seek race. The reason this matters, well, I guess I'll talk about that on the next slide, the implications, the impact arguments you would make. But first I want to talk about the uniqueness brings solvency type arguments. So the way that we find submarines is through sonar. Two types of sonar. It's a sound-based detection technology, I guess. So there's passive sonar that just listens, and there's active sonar that pings out a sound and listens for its echo back in order to determine where things are. Sonar is limited by distance because remember the chemical and geophysical properties of the ocean, that layering by temperature, by density, the pressure differentiations, means that sonar can only function a certain distance before the sound becomes attenuated and unreadable as a result. So during the Cold War, the United States developed these arrays of hydrophones. So basically think about, it's almost like a net of mechanical ears called SOSUS. So SOSUS is Sound Surveillance System. So we put it, gosh, I think it's like 23 locations around the planet. There were a lot of SOSUS arrays, and then towards the end of the Cold War we scaled back, and after the Cold War a lot of them have been abandoned or taken offline. But the point was to detect Soviet submarines, and then once you detect where it is, you put an active like attack submarine to follow it, or we also have like surveillance planes where we can drop little sonar buoys to follow it. But basically there are a lot of different sonar technologies, and the most basic one was these arrays of passive hydrophones that would just listen for submarines. However, there are new SOSUS technologies, new sonar technologies. So we've got this new P-8 surveillance plane that we're deploying in Southeast Asia that basically combines all these different platforms for detection. It drops buoys to listen. It also has like a magnetic anomaly detection thing. It's definitely military. But these technologies that can be harnessed by the P-8 plane or harnessed by other, naval sensing operations are developed for commercial and scientific research reasons. So a good example is UUVs. I think they're also called UAVs, basically underwater drones. Underwater drones can be developed for commercial purposes, for finding undersea minerals, for finding fish populations, for learning more about ocean layering, for finding a good place for OTEC. UUVs will be useful for basically every ocean activity, but they can also represent active mobile sensing platforms. You put some active sonar on an undersea glider, it has two advantages over submarine-based active sonar, which is what we rely on right now. Number one, you can have hundreds of them, so they can follow any suspicious submarine activity anywhere in the ocean. Number two, submarines have a problem of generating self-noise. It's hard to listen if you can't hear over your own self-noise. UUVs operate with gliding technology, so they're very, very quiet. So their active sonar might be more effective than the active sonar of submarines. There are also improvements in terms of when you have an array of hydrophones, their ability to communicate with one another, to share data, and also data processing has improved such that you know how you have to like separate the signal from the noise from the background acoustic environment? As computers get more powerful, we're more able to separate a tiny little signal from a lot of overwhelming noise. So this technology is advancing and can be advanced even further by AF-related investments. So, yeah, if you can develop these technologies, I mean, I think it's really easy to make an argument that the military would adopt those technologies. That evidence has to exist in a general way, that there's a lot of dual use relationship there. And I'm sure there are historical examples you could marshal too. So moving on to the next slide, why this matters. Submarines are the foundation of nuclear deterrence, full stop. So in the 1960s, so late 1960s, early 1970s, when satellite surveillance made it so that we could find land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles and we could find bombers. So there's three legs of the strategic nuclear triad. Bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, those were our original two. All of a sudden you can find those via satellite, which increases the risk of a decapitating preemptive first strike. So basically, if the Soviet Union can find all our nuclear weapons, it can destroy them all at once, and then there's no secure second strike to respond. That's the foundation of nuclear deterrence. So, in 1969, the United States military commissioned the Strat-X study, which was basically like, hey, military branches, find a way to hide our nuclear weapons again, because otherwise deterrence is going to fail. And they settled on submarine-based ballistic missiles because it's difficult to detect submarines in the ocean. If all of a sudden you can detect submarines armed with nuclear weapons in the ocean, your second strike is not so secure anymore, and it raises the risk of nuclear tension, nuclear escalation, nuclear accidents, and a nuclear war. There's a lot of evidence for this. I mean, you're probably going to have to wait until the topic is over to potentially cite the paper that we're currently working on, but the Center for Budgetary and Strategic Analysis, which is described as the think tank's think tank in Washington, D.C., put out a report maybe a month ago about new developments in submarine detection technology. Also, Russia is investing a lot in its submarine capabilities. The United States is slated to replace the Ohio-class Trident armed submarine. I think the program starts in like 2018 to build a whole new set of ballistic missile nuclear armed submarines, which cost like $1 billion each. It's ridiculous. But anyway, the point is submarines are super hot in the literature right now. There are a lot of follow-on articles to this CBSA report that say, you know, are submarines going to be obsolete? A lot of them don't go so far as to say, you know, new technology will cause a massive risk of nuclear great power war. I mean, no evidence typically says something like that. But I think that is an argument that is easily constructible. And you've got a good uniqueness argument because the ability for submarines to hide has outpaced the ability to find them for decades now. And this CBSA report is making a strong brink argument. The other thing I'll mention here at the bottom of the slide, I meant to mention when I was talking about the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait, is that China, and this is in the literature, China's strategy in the South and East China Sea and around the Malacca Strait is called area denial anti-access. That's that A2/AD thing. The strategy is China wants to be able to prevent the United States from safely deploying naval capabilities in those areas in the South and East China Sea. So it basically just needs submarine technology that is capable enough to make it too threatening for the United States to just deploy its navy off the coast of China. They're probably going to be able to do that maybe in 10-15 years. I don't know. They're developing a submarine program right now. But a lot of, honestly, defense hawks say that this strategy will facilitate China's invasion of Taiwan, which they will do it in a fait accompli mode, which basically means they'll do it so fast that we can't react in time, and then it'll be done and there's nothing to be done about it. And some people say that it's also the setup for them to get control of the oil deposits and the fisheries and the transportation routes through the South China Sea. So it's basically part of their strategy to grab what they're claiming territorially in the South China Sea right now. So if you can develop a technology that undermines the anti-access aerial denial strategy, then you can arguably shift the security relations in the South China Sea for the next several decades. So the detection of submarines is important for nuclear deterrence generally. It's also important for our interactions with Russia in the Arctic and important for our current and future interactions with China in the Western Pacific Ocean. So just something to think about, a way to make the topic more military than it calls for. All right, so this is my last slide. It is a goblin shark. And my closing line for the lecture is, don't fear ocean ecology as a topic area. We really need major thinking about how to better manage the ecosphere aspects of the ocean, because honestly, we look a lot more like Medea than Gaia these days in terms of the way that we are treating and using the ocean. And the concept of development that is just about taking more resources out, definitely, which is reflected in the popularity of these OCF apps and any app that focuses on energy or fossil fuels. It's a kind of orientation towards the ocean that I think is leading us down a path of destruction that is going to be very difficult to come back from if we don't develop new solvency mechanisms for these problems now. So the very last thing I will say is to encourage you to go to the Women's Debate Institute website to apply if you're a young woman in high school debate, or if you think it's a good idea to keep more women in debate as you move to the more elite and to the collegiate levels. Consider donating. Every single dollar goes towards the tuition and the travel for attendees to our camp. So it's a really good organization. Thank you to Eric and Eric for putting together this lecture series. I really enjoyed doing it, and I hope to see more of Turns Case lectures in the future. So have a good day, and good luck with the rest of your season.